days are difficult for many people. In fact, for a lot of people, every day may be difficult. So we wanted to find out how we put into practice the fact that we feel anxious. Because if you read the Bible, then sometimes it says, don't be anxious, don't worry about this, everything will be fine. But how do we do that? How do we put that into practice? So, Kate Middleton is a psychologist, author and director and broadcaster, and she's looking fabulous on Zoom at the moment, but we nearly didn't have that because I forgot to send the invite. Sorry, Kate.
No worries, Gareth. Glad to be able to join you.
Now, just tell me the difference, because many people won't know this, and until we spoke a few days ago, I didn't know. What's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist?
Oh, yeah, well, that's an interesting one. That's a common question. It's basically the direction that they've got to where they're coming from. So psychiatrists come from a medical training. They're qualified medical doctors, so they can prescribe and they've come through med school, whereas psychologists have done a degree in psychology and then they've done some clinical training. And there's actually lots of different types of psychologists. So you can have a clinical psychologist, educational psychologists work in schools, academic psychologists doing research and trying to understand the mind better, all sorts.
A friend of mine works in sport, and he said that recently there's been a massive uptake in sports psychologists because it's a lot to do with the mind, isn't it? I mean, it is okay if you're out training morning, noon and night, the body's right, but the mind needs to be right as well.
Oh yeah, so much. I mean, I used to play football when I was a bit younger, and I was really good defense, but I was no good at all playing attack because I was fine till the moment I got in front of the goal, and then I just something used to happen in my head and I couldn't focus. And I think what's really interesting about your mind is that's so much what it's like. It's like it releases your full potential. Your mind's the filter that you do and interact with life through. So sometimes if we think about our mind a little bit more, we can release more potential. We can find some extra depths of what we can achieve, what we can do. But sometimes our mind can make life harder too. So sometimes it's about how do you manage the challenges of 21st century life better so that you can achieve everything that you could do.
We did hear on the news that there's experts saying about how we approach our children going back to school because they've been off for a long time. So we have our own expert, you. We may as well ask you, as you're here, as parents, depending on how old the children are, it's a challenge for everybody, but what do we do? How do we set our children up mentally well for going back to school?
Yeah, it's a lot about what to expect, isn't it? And this is a kind of weird time, but it's very interesting for a psychologist. There's so much going on. It's so emotionally complex. And in this season, we can think, well, everybody should just be excited because we're getting back to normal. But actually, this is a really big adjustment for your brain. And we've done a long time now of pandemic living. And so people's minds have got used to it. And particularly this year, sort of closeted away, it's cold and dark outside. Our minds have come to associate being at home with normal routine and with being safe. So when we sending our kids back to school, that's great and it is exciting. But at first, it's going to trigger some anxiety because it's a bit different. And anxiety is kind of like your smoke alarm in your brain. It warns you when there's stuff going on that might be different, might be important. Maybe you might need to do something. So I think with our kids, what we can say to them is like, don't freak out, don't panic. If you feel a bit anxious, if this feels a bit uncertain and a bit new, I know it's going back to something that's old, but for your brain, it actually feels quite new. And so we can say, get them to expect that. And as they get used to it, as they walk through and they get back into this new routine, that will actually settle and they'll start to excite it. And we can give them, I talk with my son, he's 8, about like anchor points in his day. What are the exciting things he can look forward to? Like the first time he spots his best mate across the school playground or school break time, or, you know, those little anchor points in the day, things from that old routine that they remember. And that will help them as they just readjust. But basically, we've got to support them and hold our own nerves, because for us as well, I mean, I've heard today was described on the news this morning on the headlines as a day of anxiety. And sometimes I just think as parents, actually, the best thing we can do is hold our own nerves and anxiety so that we can then support our kids.
The mind, the brain is such a clever thing. And what's interesting about you is that you've got both sides covered. So you've got the medical side of it covered. You know how the brain works. You know how we think. But you're also a Christian. So sometimes it can be difficult to read things in the Bible and put that into practice in particular. So one fine example is if we look at Philippians 4 verse 6, and it simply says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving present your request to God." Now, to somebody who hasn't got a faith, that may seem a very strange thing to do, because you've got these physical worries, these physical anxieties inside, but this book here is telling us not to be anxious. So how do you approach that? What do you do in that situation?
Yeah, and we've got to remember as well that as human beings, the way our brain is designed, you will have seasons where you feel anxious. And like you say, you hear a verse like that and you're like, oh, seriously? Well, that's not helpful. Like, there's loads to be anxious about right now. What do you mean, don't be anxious? Like you say, and I've had conversations in the last couple of weeks about that particular chapter. And what we've got to understand, if we're looking at the Bible, is what it really says. And to do that, we have to look at the language it was written in, because the Bible wasn't written in English. So the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek, and they're both beautiful, poetic languages. And so often when we translate something into English from one of these languages, something simple and stark, like it comes out as "do not fear," but actually the original language meant something so much more beautiful and complex. So I'm actually going to talk in a minute about that example that you've just shared, Gareth, from Philippians. But let's look at another. Here's a word from the New Testament that's often translated as "do not fear," and it's this word, Greek word phobos. It's the one we get our word phobia from. So it's a ph for at the beginning, and phobos is a word that does describe a kind of anxiety, but it's really specific. It describes what you feel when you are terrified, when you're freaking out, when you feel like your capacity to cope with what life is throwing at you in that moment has been exceeded. So it has this really specific meaning for those moments when your head is telling you the only thing you can do here is get out, run, flee, get away. It is those moments where we just feel totally overwhelmed and exhausted and panicked. So it's way more than anxiety. And one example of when this word comes up is when Jesus walks out on the water to the disciples. It's this story in the Gospels when they've had a really long day and they're trying to get this boat across a lake in the darkness of the middle of the night, and they're fighting storm strength winds that are against them, and they are just at the edge of themselves. They're exhausted and they're terrified. They don't think they're going to make it. They're aware that they're about to run out of strength and energy, and they're right at their limit. And Jesus walks out across the water, which was probably a bit unexpected, I admit, and he says to them, "Do not fear." But what he's saying, we could misunderstand that, and it feels like what he's saying is, "You idiot, stop freaking out, don't be anxious, don't be scared." But they're in the middle of a storm and it's pitch black. But what he's saying to them is this word: do not panic, don't freak out, don't feel like you're overwhelmed. You know, this isn't a reprimand, it's a reassurance. He's not telling them off for their anxiety, but he's calming their panic. He's stepping into the middle of their storm and their darkness and their terror, and he's saying, "Listen, I know this is hard. I know it feels like you're out of your depth. I know you don't know how you're going to do this. I know you feel at your limit, but it's going to be okay. You don't need to run." And he tells them they can take courage because they're not on their own. He's there. It's a massive reassurance. And you know, overwhelm has been such a feature of this season, hasn't it? You know, parents is one group, they're sending their kids back, but we've done this crazy season of homeschooling, so many people juggling homeschool and work, and there's so much else going on. Those moments where you just hear someone say "mom" or "dad" or "I'm stuck," and you're trying to do a call, and that feeling of overwhelm just swamps you.
Yeah.
And in this moment with so much going on, Jesus is saying you might be anxious, but you don't need to panic. And that verse that you've just mentioned, Gareth, in Philippians 4, it's another beautiful word, so evocative in this moment with so many mixed emotions. You know, we've got the excitement, but we're anxious about what's going to happen next. We're cautious in case it all goes wrong again. We're maybe worried. And the word that he uses in that passage in Philippians, it's another, it's one of my favorite words. It refers to moments when your mind feels divided, when there's so much that you feel you're trying to keep in your head, so much you need to keep your attention on, so many balls in the air, you feel like divided, torn. It's like your mind's almost pulled apart. You're in pieces because of all the things you've got on your mind that you're worried about. And Paul says, don't be in pieces, find peace. He says you can hand that stuff over to God, and he promises that when you do that, something amazing happens. It's something beyond our human brain and brilliance. It's a peace that comes from God. So again, what he's saying is he's not saying don't be anxious. He's not telling you off. He's just saying don't get to that stage where you're beside yourself, because God wants to help you. So yeah, again, what he's saying is he wants to help you not be pushed over an emotional edge. God wants you to know when it feels like you're at your limit, when you're at the end of yourself, it's okay. That isn't the end, because God is there. God's with you. He's got this. So take courage. You don't have to run. This isn't going to overwhelm you.
Powerful stuff. We're going to play a song, and then we're going to come back to you, because we've got a few listener questions, if that's okay, which I imagine any professional who we ever have on, we say, we've got listener questions. I imagine that their heart sinks to a, what are you going to ask me on live radio? But I promise you, nothing to confuse you or stitch you up.
Another good question.
Kate Middleton, back after this. This is Connect Radio, where it's a pleasure for us to be joined by Kate Middleton. Now, she is a psychologist, she's an author, she's a director, and director of Mind and Soul UK. So, Kate, tell us a little bit about your organisation, Mind and Soul UK. I'm intrigued.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So we are the Mind and Soul Foundation. So if you want to look up our website, we're mindandsoulfoundation.org, all as one word. And like you say, at Mind and Soul UK on all social media and YouTube. And we are a national organisation, and we are passionate about the church, but we're passionate about the brain. So this brilliant space where we can talk about emotional health and well-being, and that includes illness, because sometimes you can become unwell with your emotional well-being, and that causes real problems. So we want to support people and make sure the church understands that well. But also it is about how do we manage the challenges of 21st century life? How do we support people so that they don't just survive and kind of manage to bumble on through life, but you can really thrive? And that includes in moments of challenge. So throughout pandemic, we've been working really hard just trying to support people and giving practical tips and tricks to help get through. Like, how do you manage a crazy season like this? And what does the Bible have to say that's relevant to pandemic life in 2021?
Now, questions here. So we've only got time for two, but I think we'll start with this one, because this will probably be an answer which could take us till about 10 o'clock. So try and keep it short if you can, but I know that's hard because there's so many different angles to take on this. But Paul in Exeter says, one thing I've struggled with is knowing if it's God speaking to me or if it's my own mind. Maybe that is a question for Kate. That is a difficult one, and I've seen.
Oh yeah, we need like a whole hour's program.
Absolutely, because there's so many different angles in there. So, try your best, Kate, on that one. How do we know? Is it God speaking in our minds, or is it our own mind?
Okay, so it's kind of interesting, and I don't think it's totally binary, like it's one or the other. What I mean is that quite often God does speak to you through your mind, your instincts. There's episodes in the Bible where God speaks through an emotional moment. Sometimes it is thoughts that pop into your head. What I'd say on that one really is that we think about the way God speaks in the same way that we hear sort of evil speak sometimes, because we're so used to dark stuff and difficult stuff and evil stuff, which speaks so loud. And evil, it's loud, it grabs your attention, it's everywhere, it's on the media, it's on the news, it's on the headlines, you can't miss it. And we get so used to that, we think God's going to speak in the same way. But in 1 Kings, there's this story where a guy called Elijah has this encounter with God, and he makes the same mistake. There's this earthquake and there's a fire, there's lots of noisy, attention-grabbing stuff, but God's not in any of them. And it's only when all that pauses and drops down, there's this like still small voice, and that's God speaking. So what I would say is learning to recognize God's voice is a journey. We have to get used to how to do it, how to focus our attention, how to hear clearly, but also how to move our attention from the stuff in our world that's so attention grabbing, and to get used to hearing that little voice. And it takes time. And so how do you distinguish God from your mind? Well, it's about learning, and it's about doing that journey with God and getting to know him. You know, everything about God is about relationship. It's not like a magic trick. It's about getting to know someone. You know, when your best mate shouts you across the street, you recognize their voice immediately because you know them and you've hung out with them and you've spent time with them. And it's a bit the same with God.
Amy's been in touch and she says, we do hear a lot that exercise helps with your mental health, but is there any certain exercises or regimes that Kate would suggest that help more than others do? So I think she's meaning there, are we talking about high intensity stuff? Is that better?
Yeah,
or maybe
sure.
just a small walk in the park to see the beauty? Which would you suggest is best, if either?
So there's a few things going on with exercise. So number one, let's talk endorphins, because endorphins are like chemicals released by your brain when you do fairly intense exercise, and they help you to feel calmer. They're really good counteract to stress, so they drop your stress level. They can help you manage anxiety and stuff like that. And oh my goodness, in this season, endorphins can be your friend. You know, there's so much going on right now that we cannot change, we cannot solve. So actually what we've got to look at is really good practical ways to manage the emotion and stress load of that stuff if you're just in a difficult moment. In that case, endorphins are your friend. So we're talking like 30 to 40 minutes at least of intense-ish exercise. So it doesn't really matter what you do, but you'll probably need to work up a sweat. I say to people, they always say, like, what about walking? I'm like, okay, listen, if it's the kind of walk where you can still hold a cup of coffee without spilling it, it's probably not intense enough. So that's a rough measure. But there's other stuff going on with exercise. So very often with exercise, we get out into the fresh air, especially at the moment, you know, the gyms are shut. The psychologist in me is kind of pleased. I'm not pleased, all you guys, you gym bunnies who are missing it. I hope you can get back to it soon. But we know one of the good things about exercise is it does get you out into the fresh air. There's a bunch of studies that get people to do the exact same exercise workout on like a stationary exercise bike. And they actually put the bike in different places. So sometimes it's in a house, sometimes it's in a gym, and sometimes it's in the middle of a field. Yeah, it's that bizarre a study. But what they find is the people who do the exercise in the fresh air, they get a bigger mental health kick from it. So they feel more better than everyone else, to use bad English. So there's something about exercise that it's not just the exercise, it is the getting out, it's the change of scene, it's the being in the fresh air. So in that case, anything that gets you out of the house is good. And the other thing with exercise is it's often about social contact. So if you can do something with a mate, you know, we are allowed to do one-to-one walks right now, or you can go for a jog with a mate, grab your bike, go for a ride together, then you've got another win. And I guess if you're really clever, you can combine all of them. You can do something reasonably intense outside with a mate, and then it's like a hat trick.
Excellent stuff there, Kate. Thank you so much. Can we book you again for a few weeks' time? Because I think there's so much that we can talk about, and we've only probably delved into about 5% of that.
Yeah, let's do it. Really happy to do it. It'd be great to spend some more time chatting.
You can find out more about Kate by just searching her out. Kate Middleton. She's a no, she's not. She's a psychologist. I'm ever so sorry. She's a psychologist. She's an author and director of Mind and Soul UK. Go and have a look, and we'll speak again soon, Kate.